Hello, my friends. And now we get to part two of the Battle of Britain. So, in the previous one, we looked at overview and German strategy. And so, here we are going to look at the actual fighting, so the tactics of the battle and outcomes, and then assess the reasons for those outcomes, which brings us to the learning outcomes, which are as same as before. Basically, understanding what was fought, how it was fought, and why the results were as they were. Which brings us to the actual fighting. I'll try to do this in 30 seconds or less. Oh, bless you if you actually believe that. All right. The German Air Force at first bombed infrastructure necessary for functioning of the British Air Force. So the idea was to get rid of munitions factories, radar stations, harbors, stuff like that. So they didn't know they were radar stations, but they knew they were important. And so being ever confident, they estimated 4 days. They estimated and budgeted for 4 days to defeat the Royal Air Force Fighter Command in southern England. And then, again, more confidence, 4 weeks to then destroy all military installations and to completely destroy the aircraft industry. And Germany needed a greater kill ratio than the Royal Air Force because this wasn't the end. Hitler was planning to turn his attention to the Soviet Union. So essentially, they needed to be able to come out ahead in terms of having fewer planes destroyed and stuff like that. And then terror bombing was supposed to be in the last resort if they did not achieve air superiority. Again, the purpose here was try to get Britain to capitulate, not necessarily to occupy Britain. All right, here we go. Pattern of contrails over the English Channel. And this was essentially, again, the plan. You can see in red where the German airfields and launch sites were located. And then you can see that green line was essentially to be what they were supposed to destroy within those first 4 days, and then move up, flowing northward toward Scotland. And so they had different regions different groups to attack the different regions. And then it was also supposed to be simultaneous attack from Norway and France. And initially, I want to say it's because partly they didn't want to make like a complete enemy out of Britain, but also because there was a great respect, for the British and essentially what they had achieved in terms of, people like empires. The people who rule the empires like empires. The people living inside, not so much. And so initially, Hitler did not want to resort to terror bombing. Every effort should be made to preserve human life. It was just to bring Britain to the negotiating table. However, human error, and this was essentially the beginning of this type of warfare. And so we have a lack of accuracy, and instead of hitting the appropriate targets, they hit places where people were, and you have a lot of deaths. And so then you have the British Air Force retaliating in Berlin. So the idea is, well, you bombed us in London, we're going to bomb your capital city. Again, inaccuracy, lots of people dead. And so by the time we get to September, Hitler is all out for terror bombing. And if you remember what I spoke about a few minutes ago, you should remember the bit about at what stage they resorted to terror bombing. Basically, by the time you get to September, Hitler has realized that this invasion is not possible, right? He needs a lot more planes out there in order to make this a success. At the same time, he's trying to hold back some resources to be able to be used in later portions of the war. So, therefore, instead of the whole dogfighting stuff, mano a mano, plane to plane, that was my imitation of an airplane. I hope you liked it. So then you have the move to terror bombing to demoralize Britain. And so they switch from daytime to nighttime bombings. The idea, of course, is that it's dark. People are asleep. They're woken up in the middle of the night. People are afraid for the sun to go down because they don't know if they're going to be bombed or not. So this was psychological warfare. And then eventually this also isn't working out because he can't get Britain to the negotiating table. Britain kind of hunkers down, and people are hiding in the tubes, in the underground tube stations, all of this stuff. And so he's not able to win this war in essentially the 5-6 weeks that he had budgeted. It's now spreading into months, and it's putting him behind in his timetable to invade the USSR. So he basically says that he's going to end this Battle of Britain and postpone it until sometime in the spring of 1941 he would resume. And the reason for this, of course, is because the RAF did a lot more damage to Germany than was expected. And of course, Hitler needs this to be a sort of righteous war in a way, and he needs the support of the people at home. The home front is always important, and he needs the support of the people at home. And so people aren't likely to support this continual bombing. And as you know, when we talked about Hitler's, the extent of his totalitarianism and his control, the number of people, especially in the military, who tried to assassinate Hitler from the time the war started. And this is essentially one of the reasons why. All right, and so here we get to the portion that has pictures. I know you like the pictures. We have Calais in September 1940. So Goering is in charge of the Air Force. And now he's giving a speech about the change in tactics, this move towards terror bombing. We have an image of the bombing of London, and which brings us to looking at the flip side of it, right? So we talked about why Germany chose the tactics that she did and how those worked out. And now we'll look at Britain and how she was essentially successful. So one of the things is the radar stations. We've spoken about radar previously, and it's just this idea that they were able to identify where the German planes were going to be and target them, whereas the Germans didn't have this technology. So essentially, this tech gave the Brits a leg up, and I told you guys about the carrot story. One of the things, of course, is that Germany had these very light and very fast planes, which were very maneuverable. Unfortunately, part of the whole being light thing was having smaller fuel tanks. So by the time, and the Germans knew this, of course, which is one of the reasons why control of Norway and Belgium, Netherlands, and France was important. So, but this meant that even though they had high maneuverability, they couldn't spend as much time in the air actually fighting. And so once, the other thing, of course, is once Germany changes her tactics and starts bombing London, this meant that she stops bombing the airfields. And so part of it wasn't so much British success, but also poor German tactics. So they switched to terror bombing, which means that now, remember, of course, that a portion of the German resources are being held in reserve so that they can be used at later points in the war. So there's only a limited, well, of course, there's always limited, right? But that meant that they couldn't bomb the cities and the airfields at the same time. This meant, of course, that the British now have a chance to get their stuff together, get their planes up in the air because the pressure is off, and actually go fight Germany more, or retaliate more on German soil. The German Air Force doesn't have as good military intelligence about British defenses. And so they didn't understand about the radar. They didn't know about the fighters and the planes. And so that also meant that they had to waste time and fuel, especially time, on reconnaissance trips. And that also gives them an additional vulnerability, right? If you're reconning in an area, that kind of gives people a bit of heads up and possible plane shot down. The other thing is their previous success. As other people thought that the Germans were invincible, and so the leadership of the German military, especially Hitler, thinks that they are also invulnerable. And so that means that they have a disconnect with the reality of their resources and the reality of what they're going up against against Britain. And inconsistencies in German strategies. So essentially, they did not say bomb all of the airfields simultaneously. They bombed some munitions, some airfields, some of this. So essentially, that meant that Britain always had some functioning resources to fight this war. And the German strategy was inconsistent, so Britain could, again, rally. And here we have a handy-dandy map. Another handy-dandy map because I like maps. So here we have the radar cover of of Britain. So their radar could actually go all the way into the German bases in France, which meant that they had a significant amount of warning. Again, as I said, they didn't focus systematically on one type of target, like airfields. The other thing is, one of the issues is if you're targeting the airfields, or that's okay, or that's fine, but Britain still had large industrial capacity to replace some of what was lost. And then, as we said, Germany had lost some air force strength in the battles for Belgium, Netherlands, and France. And one of the biggest things, of course, is Britain is fighting over their home territory. Britain has not had a successful invasion, or rather, let me put it this way. No one has successfully invaded Britain since 1066. And so Britain seems to holds on to that really, really tightly, and people are defending their home territory. That means they're willing to make sacrifices. They're willing to take greater chances. Essentially, they've got nothing left to lose, and so they fight that much harder for their home. And so this is one of the reasons that Germany couldn't get Britain to come to the negotiating table. People were unwilling to give up their home. Essentially, the home front was really, really hardcore at this time. All right. Britain had high quality equipment, training, and command structure. As you know, Hitler was not the most, how do you say, efficient, effective in terms of leadership. So that meant that the various aspects of the military were actually fighting each other for control. And whereas Britain had a more streamlined command structure that meant that they basically were more unified in fighting. And then, of course, Britain had a multinational force, one from the British Dominions like Canada, that's right, Canada, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. But also, one of the biggest things that Britain had was that it was the home base of these governments in exile and the military that they commanded. And one of the really big things about this is the British king and queen. They sent the kids to like Canada, but they actually stayed in London during the bombings with the people, kind of encouraging people to hold strong and helping to boost that home front. And so they may not have a huge role politically, but the traditional position is essentially as a representative and embodiment of the spirit of the people, and they definitely fulfilled that at the time. And here we go, an image of the Polish 303 Squadron pilots in 1940. One of the things is when we talk a lot about World War II, especially in the more European-focused fronts, people focus a lot on British, American, and Russian or Soviet forces. But the role that these other countries played was really vital because they themselves were fighting for their homes. And so that brings us to the next bit. You thought it was the surprise, didn't you? In sum, explain how the outcomes of the Battle of Britain influenced the tactics and outcomes of another front in World War II. Ha! Surprise! The surprise is that you don't actually get a joke this time. But you do get a picture of this skeptical kitty. Nice. Just kidding. Would I do that to you? Here it comes. What's the difference between a cat and a comma? Yup, think about it. And one has claws at the end of his paws, and the other has a pause at the end of a clause. You loved it.